Picture this. It's early May 2024. After more than a decade of legal battles, construction delays, and political fights, Canada finally switches on the expanded Trans Mountain Pipeline. For the first time in modern history, large volumes of Canadian oil can move directly to the Pacific coast and onto tankers bound for Asia. Within months, shipping data showed something that quietly stunned energy analysts. China overtook the United States as the largest buyer of crude shipped through the pipeline. That wasn't a projection or a political claim. It was visible in tanker movements and export volumes tracked by energy markets and confirmed by reporting from Reuters. That single shift signals something much larger than oil logistics. It marks a structural change in how Canadian energy moves through the world and how much leverage Washington actually holds over its closest trading partner. Stay with this. The full context changes how this moment should be understood. If you're interested in this topic, hit the like button, subscribe, and type "interested" in the comments. And I will give you a heart. Here's the factual timeline based on energy data and reporting from Reuters and Canada's energy regulator. In May 2024, the Trans Mountain expansion officially entered service. The project increased pipeline capacity from roughly 300,000 barrels per day to about 890,000 barrels per day. That expansion created a direct outlet to the Port of Vancouver, allowing Canadian producers to ship crude to overseas markets without routing everything through the United States. Throughout 2025, tanker tracking showed steady growth in exports to Asia. Average shipments to China alone exceeded the volumes being shipped to the United States through the same pipeline system. South Korea, Japan, and Singapore also became consistent buyers. This matters because before the expansion, almost all Canadian crude exports went south. Canada's export infrastructure simply did not allow large-scale access to global markets. The pipeline changed that physical reality. At the same time, trade tensions between Washington and Ottawa remained elevated. Tariff disputes and political rhetoric created uncertainty for exporters. Instead of waiting for policy clarity, Canadian producers followed the path that infrastructure now allowed. If you've seen similar trade shifts in other industries, drop your thoughts in the comments. For decades, the United States benefited from a structural advantage. Canadian oil had very few places to go besides American refineries. That gave U.S. buyers strong negotiating power on pricing and contract terms. Energy analysts have long described this as a form of geographic captivity. Even if global prices rose, Canadian producers often had to accept discounted pricing because they lacked alternative export routes. The Trans Mountain expansion breaks that dynamic. Producers can now ship crude west and access international buyers paying market-based prices. That doesn't mean the U.S. market disappears, but it means it is no longer the only option. This shift represents one of the most significant changes in North American energy markets in a generation. The pipeline's completion in May 2024 added approximately 590,000 barrels per day of capacity to the West Coast, fundamentally altering the leverage equation that had defined Canadian oil exports for decades. The economic impact manifests immediately in price differentials. Historically, Western Canadian Select, the benchmark for heavy crude from Alberta's oil sands, traded at steep discounts to West Texas Intermediate, sometimes exceeding $30 per barrel. These weren't minor fluctuations reflecting quality differences. They were structural discounts imposed by transportation bottlenecks and limited market access. Canadian producers understood the problem acutely. They extracted some of the world's largest oil reserves but sold into what was effectively a monopsony, a market with only one significant buyer. American refineries along the Gulf Coast, configured specifically to process heavy Canadian crude, could negotiate aggressively because they knew producers had nowhere else to turn. The infrastructure simply didn't exist to reach alternative markets. Pipeline constraints meant that even when Asian refineries offered premium prices for heavy crude, Canadian producers couldn't capitalize. Rail transport provided some relief but remained expensive, logistically complex, and volume limited. The result was billions in foregone revenue annually, a reality that frustrated producers, provincial governments, and federal policymakers alike. The Trans Mountain expansion changes this calculus fundamentally. Oil can now flow to Burnaby, British Columbia, and be loaded onto very large crude carriers destined for refineries in China, India, South Korea, and Japan. These markets have been paying premium prices for heavy crude, often significantly above what U.S. refineries offered. Early data following the pipeline's completion shows price differentials narrowing. When Canadian producers can credibly threaten to redirect volumes westward, American buyers lose their ability to demand steep discounts. This doesn't eliminate quality-based price differences or transportation cost adjustments, but it removes the artificial discount imposed by captivity. The infrastructure economics extend beyond pricing. Investment decisions in the oil sands sector had been constrained by market access uncertainty. Companies couldn't justify expansion projects when they couldn't guarantee reasonable netbacks on production. The Trans Mountain expansion provides that certainty, potentially unlocking billions in capital investment that was previously on hold. American refineries face a corresponding adjustment. Gulf Coast facilities invested heavily in equipment specifically designed to process Canadian heavy crude. These refineries now must compete more aggressively to secure supply. Some may need to adjust their crude slates or negotiate different terms. The relationship hasn't ended, but it has rebalanced. The geopolitical dimensions are equally significant. Energy security increasingly depends on diversified supply chains and market access. Canada has long sought to reduce its dependence on a single customer, particularly given the political volatility that can characterize cross-border energy relationships. Trade disputes, regulatory changes, and political rhetoric have repeatedly demonstrated the risks of over-reliance. By establishing Pacific access, Canada joins other major oil exporters with multiple export pathways. This resembles the strategic approach taken by Middle Eastern producers, who developed both Eastern and Western export routes, or Russian energy infrastructure designed to reach both European and Asian markets. Critics of the Trans Mountain expansion focused heavily on environmental concerns, and those debates remain relevant in broader climate policy discussions. But from a pure market structure perspective, the infrastructure achieves what economic theory would predict. It reduces market power imbalances and moves prices toward competitive equilibrium. Transportation capacity has always determined commodity pricing as much as supply and demand fundamentals. Landlocked producers across industries, whether agricultural products, minerals, or energy, face similar constraints. Infrastructure investment that opens new markets consistently shifts negotiating leverage. The United States hasn't lost access to Canadian oil, but it has lost exclusive access. American refineries can still purchase Western Canadian crude, but they must now pay closer to what that crude would command in competitive international markets. For Canadian producers, this represents the difference between accepting whatever terms one buyer offers and choosing among multiple competitive bids. This isn't ideology. It's basic logistics economics. If you believe market access and infrastructure matter regardless of politics, hit like. This shift isn't happening in isolation. Canada has also been expanding its liquefied natural gas export capacity on the Pacific Coast, designed explicitly to serve Asian markets rather than North America. Provincial governments have also explored refining partnerships with Asian buyers to deepen long-term trade relationships. Export Development Canada reported a sharp increase in Canadian businesses actively searching for non-US customers during 2025. Website traffic to trade diversification tools surged as companies sought alternative buyers and supply chains. This shows a consistent pattern. Once infrastructure opens new doors, businesses move fast to reduce single market dependence. The LNG Canada project in Kitimat, British Columbia, represents the most visible example of this broader pivot. Expected to begin operations in mid-2025, this facility will export approximately 14 million tons of liquefied natural gas annually, with the majority contracted to Asian buyers including Japan, South Korea, and China. Unlike previous Canadian natural gas exports, which flowed almost entirely to U.S. markets via pipeline, this infrastructure was conceived from the outset as a Pacific gateway. The strategic logic mirrors the oil sector transformation. British Columbia holds substantial natural gas reserves, particularly in the Montney and Horn River basins. Historically, these reserves supplied American markets in the Pacific Northwest and, via pipeline networks, broader U.S. demand centers. But North American natural gas prices have remained persistently low due to the shale gas revolution, which flooded U.S. markets with domestic supply. Asian LNG prices, by contrast, have commanded significant premiums, especially during periods of high demand or supply disruption. Japanese and South Korean buyers, heavily dependent on LNG imports for power generation, have consistently paid prices multiple times higher than North American benchmarks. For Canadian producers, the mathematics became compelling. Build export infrastructure to reach premium markets rather than accept low prices in oversupplied domestic markets. Provincial governments recognized the opportunity and acted accordingly. British Columbia streamlined permitting processes, offered tax incentives, and positioned LNG development as a cornerstone of provincial economic strategy. Alberta, while landlocked, supported these initiatives knowing that increased takeaway capacity for natural gas would benefit its own substantial reserves and associated gas production from oil sands operations. The refining partnerships signal another dimension of this diversification. Rather than simply exporting raw crude, some Canadian producers and provincial entities have explored joint ventures with Asian refiners to add value domestically or establish preferential supply relationships. These arrangements go beyond spot market transactions, creating long-term contractual ties that bind economies together through mutual investment and shared infrastructure. Chinese state-owned enterprises have shown particular interest in such arrangements, viewing Canadian energy resources as a strategic hedge against Middle Eastern supply concentration. Indian refiners, facing explosive growth in domestic energy demand, have similarly explored long-term offtake agreements. These relationships often involve equity investments, technology transfers, and multi-decade supply commitments that fundamentally alter the structure of trade flows. The Export Development Canada data provides quantitative confirmation of what industry observers have noted anecdotally. Canadian businesses across sectors, not just energy, are actively seeking to reduce their exposure to U.S. market volatility and concentration risk. The 2025 surge in website traffic to trade diversification tools suggests this isn't limited to large corporations with dedicated trade strategy teams. Small and medium-sized enterprises are also exploring options, driven by concerns about tariff uncertainty, regulatory divergence, and political unpredictability in cross-border commerce. This pattern extends beyond commodities. Canadian manufacturers have begun establishing relationships with Mexican buyers and suppliers, creating North American trade triangles that don't flow exclusively through the United States. Technology companies have increased focus on European and Asian partnerships rather than viewing Silicon Valley as the default destination for innovation collaboration. Agricultural exporters have intensified efforts to penetrate Asian markets, building on successful canola and wheat exports to China and India. Financial infrastructure has adapted accordingly. Canadian banks have expanded their Asian operations, facilitating trade finance and foreign exchange services for businesses operating in these markets. Payment systems, trade documentation platforms, and logistics networks have all evolved to support diversified trade flows rather than the historically dominant north-south axis. The speed of this adjustment reveals an important economic principle. Infrastructure constraints, not preference or proximity, often determine trade patterns. Once the Trans Mountain Pipeline, LNG terminals, and expanded Pacific port facilities became operational, businesses moved quickly to utilize them. The dormant demand for market diversification existed for years. What was missing was the physical capacity to execute it. This creates a self-reinforcing cycle. As more Canadian exporters establish Asian relationships, logistics providers invest in better services for those routes. Improved logistics makes diversification more attractive to additional companies. Shipping lines add container capacity. Airlines expand cargo flights. Financial institutions develop specialized products. Each incremental improvement lowers the barrier for the next company to diversify. The United States faces a corresponding strategic challenge. For decades, geographic proximity and integrated infrastructure made the U.S. market the natural destination for Canadian exports. That advantage persists for many products, fresh produce, automotive parts, and other goods where speed and integration matter more than price. But for commodities where global markets exist and transportation costs are manageable, the automatic assumption of U.S. destination no longer holds. American policy responses have been mixed. Some voices advocate for maintaining strong bilateral relationships through fair terms and stable regulatory environments. Others have proposed protectionist measures or leverage tactics, seemingly unaware that such approaches may accelerate rather than prevent diversification. From a Canadian perspective, this diversification isn't about abandoning the U.S. market. Trade volumes remain substantial, and economic integration across many sectors continues deepening. Rather, it's about options and resilience. A company with customers in 3 continents can better weather disruptions in any single market. A producer with multiple export routes has stronger negotiating positions with all buyers. Do you see this as strategic planning or simply rational market behavior? Let me know. The distinction may be less important than it appears. Strategic planning and rational market behavior often converge. Governments provide infrastructure. Businesses utilize it to maximize returns. Provincial officials pursue diversification for political and economic resilience. Companies pursue it for profit and risk management. Both respond to the same underlying reality. Dependence on a single market creates vulnerability that infrastructure can remedy. What's clear is that the shift is accelerating, and its effects will compound over time as relationships deepen, infrastructure improves, and businesses gain experience operating in diversified markets. Here's what's measurable right now. First, Canada's crude export destinations are more diversified than at any point in modern history. Asia now absorbs a meaningful share of westbound shipments. Second, the Trans Mountain system is not yet operating at absolute maximum capacity, leaving room for additional export growth if producers continue shifting volumes west. Third, Canadian producers now have negotiating leverage that simply did not exist before. If U.S. refiners offer lower prices, producers have a viable alternative. Meanwhile, manufacturing impacts from tariffs have affected both sides of the border. Canadian manufacturing employment softened in tariff-exposed sectors, while U.S. manufacturers also faced higher input costs and supply chain disruptions according to labor and industry data. This isn't a zero-sum win. Both economies absorbed friction. The difference is Canada built optionality while U.S. exporters remain constrained by retaliatory trade barriers. Stay with me for the broader takeaway. The lesson here is simple and timeless. Trade power is built on infrastructure, not rhetoric. When a country controls multiple routes to market, it gains pricing power, flexibility, and resilience. When it depends on a single buyer or corridor, it becomes vulnerable to political pressure and economic shocks. Canada spent years taking political heat for investing in a pipeline that many thought would never pay off. Now that pipeline has reshaped Canada's trade options in a way that can't easily be reversed. Even if future governments normalize trade relations, the physical reality remains. The ports exist. The tankers sail. The contracts run for years, not election cycles. That permanently alters the balance of leverage in North American energy trade. If you value calm, fact-driven analysis that explains what headlines miss, subscribe. This channel focuses on real data, real reporting, and real-world consequences.